understand and live urban spaces. Welcome to the second episode of the second cycle of Urbanary. I'm Daphne Riga, and I'm here with Abdallah Jreij and Toka El Sayed, my colleagues at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies at the Politecnico di Milano, where we are recording this episode. Last week, Antonio, Giulia, and Stella reflected on how labor exploitation and informal settlements shape rural spaces and challenged what we consider urban and rural, center and periphery. In fact, this cycle of Urbanary aims to show that urbanization processes are not limited to the city, but can be found at places we don't usually consider as urban. In other words, the non-city. Drawing from the previous episode and our colleagues' discussion on the non-city as a place of production, in this episode we focus on a specific form of production that is centered around human experience, yet is chiefly characterized by its spatial and economic dimension: leisure. Beyond urban space, leisure is often related to specific spatial qualities and configurations. We can imagine leisure activities taking place in sandy beaches, dense forests, secluded villages, snowy mountaintops, and so on. Away from the city, leisure represents the search for enjoyment, freedom, stimulation, and the non-ordinary.
Thinking about leisure in the non-city, we chose to focus on mountain territories. Often seen as rural and untouched, mountains are frequently shaped by tourism and leisure-related events. Ski resorts, alpinism, and mega events like the Winter Olympic Games illustrate how these areas are produced and consumed through tourism. With mass tourism and mega events as key drivers of spatial transformation, we begin by asking, are these practices sustainable? In the face of global warming and climate crisis, we question whether tourism and mega events truly benefit mountain territories or harm them. Our mission in this episode is to critically explore their sustainability, not only environmentally, but also spatially, socially, and economically.
Before we dive into today's episode, we would like to acknowledge the valuable contributions of two professionals who helped shape this discussion. This episode was made in collaboration with Martin Müller, professor in the Department of Geography and Sustainability at the University of Lausanne, and Sarah Gainsforth, an independent researcher and writer. While today you will hear excerpts from the discussions we had with Martin and Sarah, you will find the full interviews with both contributors on our website, urbanary.polemy.com, in a dedicated repository of conversations expanding on the themes of this episode.
In her article, La montagna non è un luna park, which means the mountain is not an amusement park, Sarah Gainsforth argues that tourism has radically transformed mountain territories and the lifestyles of those who live there, and that today, amid gentrification, climate change, and the upcoming 2026 Winter Olympics in Milano Cortina, the time has come to rethink our relationship with mountains. For us, the starting point for our inquiry on the sustainability of leisure practices in mountain territories is to ask this question: what are the effects of mass tourism and mega events on mountain territories? In examining how tourism has shaped mountain territories over recent decades, we've come to see its impacts as both tangible and intangible. While leisure practices often leave visible marks, like infrastructure development, they also shape immaterial dimensions tied to social and experiential values. Since the 19th century, mountains have been experienced as spaces of spectacle, influencing how we perceive these landscapes today. These tangible and intangible effects are deeply interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Crucially, they're also shaped by governance, which operates between the material and immaterial realms. Through the management of funds and policies for tourist development, mountains increasingly undergo transformation processes that affect local societies in terms of spatial justice. This is how we will approach the topic in this episode. We will address the effects of tourism and mega events on mountain territories in a threefold manner. Firstly, in spatial and tangible terms. Secondly, in terms of governance. And thirdly, in terms of the intangible human experience.
Before we delve into our discussion on the effects of tourism and mega events in mountain territories, and before we inquire about whether they are sustainable or not, let us first provide some definitions. First of all, we should explain that the term tourism refers to the activity of traveling and staying at places for leisure purposes. But when it comes to mass tourism, things become more complex. Although mass tourism is a recurrent topic of discussion in academic and public spheres worldwide, scientific contributions to its conceptualization are unexpectedly limited. We have asked Sarah to provide her own definition of mass tourism.
Yes, I would say it's a phenomenon which is closely linked. I mean, it's the expression of basically of consumer society, and so of a kind of society based on an economic structure that arose especially after World War II. So it's the result of a series of processes of technological advances which took place in transport, for example, mobility means, but also on the whole, it's the result of, the system that arises with mass production. And so it's a whole new culture where you have more free time, you have paid free time, so you have vacation. So basically, tourism becomes a mass practice. It's not just, the elite that can travel and see the world. So this is the main, of course, shift behind the growth of mass tourism. It's, this economic prosperity, increased availability of time, of credit, and all this.
Like Sarah, many scholars describe mass tourism as a very particular kind of tourism. One shaped by mass production, mass consumption, and mass destinations. It's not just about the number of tourists, but about a system that prioritizes quantity over quality. In other words, it's a model rooted in consumerism. Researchers argue that mass tourism is a product of a capitalist logic, one driven by profit, economic growth, and values like efficiency, productivity, and competition. This helps explain why the tourism industry often promotes expansion and growth, even at the cost of local communities and natural landscapes. This is also true for mega events, as they operate under similar premises. Mega events are large-scale, internationally significant events that attract widespread media attention, large audiences, and imply substantial economic, social, and political impact. As Martin told us during our discussion with him,
so mass tourism in the context of mega events is very interesting because you could say that it was actually only through mass tourism that those events became mega events, so very big events. Because essentially much of their size comes from the fact that they have a significant number of tourists that come and want to see the athletes compete in real life and not just on the screen. And for allowing mega events to grow so massively, mass tourism was a key ingredient. So the fact that you nowadays can have millions or even tens of millions of visitors to big events like the Olympic Games is closely connected to the fact that mass means of transportation, train, and then the plane later on have become accessible to large proportions of the population.
When we think of mass tourism in terms of production, consumption, and movement, it's also important to consider how these processes shape physical space. This includes purpose-built resorts, hotels, second homes, theme parks, and even the rapid expansion of restaurants and bars catering to tourist demand. In mountain territories, and especially in the case of ski tourism, Sarah elaborated on how mass tourism has led to significant material transformations of these landscapes.
Well, I mean, it's incredible to think how much physical transformation has taken place because of mass tourism. So it's hard to realize how much the mountains have changed. I mean, because we don't see that from where we live usually in cities, but how much infrastructure has been built just around, the tourism industry. So as I was mentioning before, it's, ski resorts and ski lifts, but also, roads to access these infrastructures, accommodation facilities, restaurants. So this is basically, what I talk about in the article when we basically it's the urbanization of mountain areas.
Likewise, mega events offer a kind of tourist experience that is only made possible through specific spatial configurations. In order to host mega events, destinations need to invest on highly specialized infrastructure and amenities that are not only related to the possibility of successfully responding to tourism demand by visitors, but also need to fulfill the requirements of hosting the event per se.
Let's take a closer look at tangible impacts of mass tourism and mega events on mountain regions, particularly in relation to environmental sustainability. One key theme that emerged in our conversations with Martin and Sarah is the concept of white elephants, infrastructures that end up abandoned, underused, or no longer serving their purposes. In both mass tourism and mega events, these structures reflect the temporary nature of the spectacle, leaving behind buildings and venues that often outlive their function.
So you can have white elephants that fall completely into disuse. Often that's the case with extremely specialized infrastructure like the ski jumps, for example, or the bobsleigh run, because they're extremely costly to maintain. Maintaining a bobsleigh run costs so often a couple of hundreds of thousands or even millions per year if you want to do it properly. Then there's infrastructure that's not used to capacity. So, for example, you can look at the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing, which was built for the 2008 Games. It has a capacity of, I think, 70 or 80,000 people. But nowadays, it's very rarely used for that many people. It still hosts stuff, but not actually for at the capacity that it was built for. And the other version of a white elephant is just something that was built for one thing, but then needed to be converted into another thing in order to function well. And often this is a conversion that comes at a significant cost. You can look at the Olympic Stadium in London 2012 as a white elephant in that sense, because it was an athletic stadium, and in order for it to find a tenant that would rent it later on, it had to be converted into a football stadium, and which is not, you don't do that with a snap of your fingers. So it cost, I think, several hundreds of millions of pounds, I think, even to do this conversion. So in that sense, this was also a white elephant because it was not used for its original purpose.
And just to add to Martin's list, we may also recall, among others, the white elephants of the 2004 Olympic Games left in Athens, or of the 2006 Winter Olympics in Turin. For Martin, white elephants represent one of the negative effects of tourism and mega events on mountain territories, as they are environmentally and economically unsustainable. Similarly, Sarah pointed out that shifts in lifestyle and climate change further highlight the unsustainable nature of white elephants.
Also because, that was the shift that has taken place in the meantime from when, these places, these ski resorts were booming. There has been, on the one hand, another, economic shift, so we don't have that kind of long vacation time anymore. So people's lifestyles and habits and desires have changed. Also with climate change, many of these places are in abandonment. And so now we have what, you referred to as white elephants scattered across the mountains. But unfortunately, it's very hard then, to go back to revert all that damage done to build those infrastructures. And so the environmental degradation, even just talking about, in terms of deforestation, for example. And that's why it's so really incredible that this is still taking place today, when it's become so obvious that this is not acceptable anymore. The building of such large, heavy infrastructure causing so much environmental damage.
In this context, mountains face an uncertain future. Climate change is now visibly exposing the environmental damage fueled by the tourism industry, which accounts for more than 8% of global carbon emissions. In her article, Sarah explains that warming is happening at twice the global average rate in the Alps, and temperatures in mountain regions are expected to rise by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius by 2050. Sarah also points out that a 2-degree rise in temperature could push the snow line by up to 500 to 1,000 meters by 2100. In other words, what we currently experience at 1,500 meters will shift to around 2,000 meters in 80 years. And even now, snow is already disappearing at 1,500 meters.
Yes, well, in fact, I mean, there's this, what I was already mentioning before, there's a shortening of the ski seasons, with there's less snow, warmer winters, and so there's less natural snowfall, particularly in the lower altitude resorts. And so there's this reduction of tourism revenue, which is, on the one hand, I would say it's spurring two kind of responses. One is interesting and is positive, and the other one is not. And the second one is, this artificial snowmaking, which is, being also funded with public state funds, also European funds, just to carry on the snowmaking, which is totally unsustainable, and so this is still going on in many parts of Italy where it doesn't snow anymore, and this of course it just makes matters worse, because artificial snowmaking requires increased energy consumption and water sources, much more than often, than what is naturally provided there. And so this is just, it just means more and more, carbon emissions and environmental degradation. And so it's just accelerating, actually, what, the cause of the shortening of the ski season, which is, climate change. And climate change, is spurred by higher carbon emissions. So it's just a vicious circle.
In her article, Sarah indicates that nowadays 90% of ski slopes in the Italian Alps are already covered with artificial snow. As more ski lifts below 2,000 meters are shut down, either permanently or temporarily, due to insufficient snowfall, there's a growing trend in building water reservoirs for artificial snow production. These rely on diverting water from rivers and streams, but it's a strategy that is unsustainable by nature. At the same time, many Italian regions are facing critical water shortages. Artificial snowmaking exemplifies the fact that, even if climate change and global warming constitute a significant challenge for tourism and mega events in mountain territories, host destinations identify ways to sidestep these challenges and meet tourist demand. But not for long, according to Martin.
Essentially, today, we don't know what the winters will look like in 30 years down the line. We have a rough idea. They'll probably be much warmer. But at the scale of the resolution of individual winter sports resorts, or even at the scale of the Alps, there's significant uncertainty to the degree where we don't know whether we'll be able at all, in fact, to ski in 30 years down the line, even with all the technological artificial snowmaking potential that we have. So this means that if you take sustainability as the idea that something is sustainable in the long run, that you can sustain it, there is a big question mark, actually, whether any of those infrastructures that are getting built now can be sustained over 20, 30, 40 years, given how climate change is progressing at the moment.
Talking about the environmental sustainability of tourism and mega events in mountain territories, we have seen that references to governance, management of funds, and economic costs have come up quite a few times in our discussion. According to Sarah, last year the Italian Ministry of Tourism has invested hundreds of millions of euros for the modernization and implementation of artificial snow on ski slopes, as opposed to only 4 million euros that were invested in ecotourism policies. In her view, the current national and regional policies in Italy contradict the goals of the National Climate Adaptation Strategy, which advocates for expanding tourism options in mountain regions rather than relying solely on winter tourism. When it comes to mega events, Martin argues that governance and funds are very related to the building of new infrastructure.
Very immediately, there are construction contracts, there are politicians who are staking their reputations on those projects and so on. So often this money gets spent for the benefit of a few, but not for the benefit of society at large. And so one thing that needs to change is also the governance of how those funds are being spent. And one way one could do this is to clearly, for example, fix a spending limit, clearly only bid for Olympic Games if all of the venues you have are pre-existing, or you can cooperate with other countries to use those venues. But we've seen that this is not necessarily very much welcomed at the moment by the International Olympic Committee. Switzerland made such a bid for the Winter Olympic Games 2030 exactly. But the response was from the IOC that no, it's too much spread out across the country, and we need to cluster it a little more. And the idea to spread out across the country was obviously to make use of venues that are already in existence, but that are not all in the same place, and to also spread the benefits a little bit more, and not have mass tourism, because we spoke about that. So tourism massed in one place, but spread more evenly across the country. So you wouldn't have this infrastructural surges of demand in specific places. So the solutions are out there. At the moment, we just don't have the structures to implement those solutions.
As Martin points out, mountain territories are undergoing spatial and economic changes that are usually associated with cities. But as this Urbanary series seeks to highlight, forms of urban development are now extending to non-city spaces, often without adapting to their unique context. Sarah notes that tourism's economic impact is typically short-lived and benefits only a small group, like Airbnb hosts or restaurant owners, who often drive deeper changes in the social and commercial fabric. Even practices like short-term rentals, once limited to cities, now pervade mountain regions. As Sarah reminds us, quoting Antonio De Rossi, these patterns bring to the mountains the very same urban mindset and development logic that people originally came there to escape.
Yes, in fact, I mean, it's like mountains are thought of by people living in cities just as places for entertainment, like as if they were yet another urban attraction, basically. So this is, what is commodifying mountain space. And so this, it entails standardization, commercialization, and so it kind of just prioritizes certain experiences, leisure activities over others. And so this just becomes, the means of changing these places into vacation spaces. Whereas, these are often places that need to, maybe attract new residents to be revitalized by other means, and not just through ski resorts and hotels and that kind of leisure activity facilities. And so I would say that it's the same dynamic that we can see in cities that takes place in mountain areas.
Such dynamics of governance are aligned with issues that often characterize cities: gentrification, job insecurity, displacement. But above all, they illustrate that leisure and tourism practices, despite being commodified, commercialized, and practiced en masse, are still permeated by class issues. More in particular, access to mega events is rather limited, as those are highly exclusive.
Mega event tourism is actually relatively expensive, especially if you want tickets to the competitions. So certainly for the Olympic Games, I know for most tickets you're looking at least €100, often several hundreds of euros for one ticket only. And then you have to factor in accommodation, which during the event is also extremely expensive. So you're ending up with significant price tags. So in that sense, it's not democratic mass tourism that everybody could do it, but actually you need to have significant money saved in order to do this.
Mega events are often promoted as engines of tourism, investment, and growth. But as Martin pointed out, the reality is more complex. Research shows that they rarely attract new tourists and often just displace those who would have come anyway, especially in already popular destinations during peak seasons, like ski resorts in February. This can damage a place image, pushing towards mass tourism at odds with today's preference for boutique, personalized travel. Despite their limited benefits, mega events continue to be promoted largely because they often open the door to public funding and allow property owners to raise prices. As Martin and Sarah both suggest, this support to mega events often reflects vested interests disguised as development. Ultimately, what's missing is a clear policy vision for managing tourist demand, one that questions who has access to leisure, land, and resources. A policy not based on wealth, but on principles of spatial justice and long-term sustainability.
So, when we look at the tourist demand, and so I think it's important to have policies in place to ensure, that there's always, this class issue behind, often, which is not, specifically addressed, but it's always there. I mean, when we talk about, how to reshape the demand and the supply of touristic activities, there's often a class element. And so, on the supply side and the policy side, there is this tendency to try to foster, what they call, in Italy, high quality tourism, luxury tourism, which just means, you kind of want to, cater to high spending, luxury, richer tourists, and kind of, phase out poor tourism. But I think it's very important also at times of climate change to create an offer for poor people, especially people living in cities that are less and less livable because of climate change.
Contrary to alpinism and trekking, in which the activity consists in the slow ascent of the mountain, skiing has more to do with the descent and speed. In fact, Sarah mentions ski tourism as one of the first forms of immaterial and experiential tourism, which fundamentally changed the way we perceive the mountain landscapes.
Actually, this is a concept I read in Antonio De Rossi's monumental work on the Alps. It's called La costruzione delle Alpi. And he talks about how skiing changed the experience of that we have of the mountain areas, and so then this changed the mountains themselves. So skiing is much more focused on the experience than on the physical destination. I mean, people go to places to ski; they don't go there just to see that destination. So this is one main point. So places become settings for this experience, and so they kind of lose importance. And so this is the big change that you mentioned, which takes place with the descent and speed. It changes the whole experience, which was it used to be a very difficult experience, to climb up a mountain, and this changes completely. And so mountains become places of leisure, of fun, of adventure, of thrill, and so this changes our whole perception of the mountain area very radically.
Such a change in perception comes hand in hand with a change in physical space through commodification of leisure. the mountains transformed physically into leisure space, or, to use Sarah's words, into playgrounds designed for recreational use. And evidently, such a material transformation attributes to ski tourism additional values that are related to lifestyle and status, and are often part of this contested access to tourism and leisure that Abdallah was just discussing. But how are mountains symbolically represented in the collective imaginary for leisure today? Here's what Martin thinks.
So the question is, what do you look for in mountains, right? And I think, many people, when they go to the mountains, they're looking for a kind of dissociation or a retreat or some escapism from society. So often the mountains are also culturally imagined as a wilderness, as a rough place, as a cold place, also as an authentic place, an original place, right? Now, of course, we all know that this imaginary is constructed and is often also maintained by tourism actors as well. Switzerland, where I'm based, has a very strong narrative of the mountains as authentic and steeped in traditions and intact place also, an intact place, an untouched place, an unspoiled place as well, where we can get away from civilization and all the ills of civilization, be it climate change or environmental destruction or pollution and so on. So this is a bit the imaginary of mountains as we have them at the moment.
But if we consider what we discussed earlier regarding the environmental sustainability of mega events, then this imaginary of the mountain as an untouched, authentic place appears to be quite paradoxical. We ask ourselves, how do mega events fit into this romanticized image of mountain territories? If mega events are largely about spectacle, from the opening ceremonies to the competitions and the closing celebrations, how do they reshape the way people experience mountain territories both during and after the event?
So, of course, mega events don't fit into this imaginary, right? Because as you rightly said, they are a spectacle. So a spectacle means they are big, they are large, they pull things off that are out of the ordinary. They're often also very technological, both in the large media presence that is implied, but also in the technological advances that are being used to construct many of the stadia, for example. So they change those imaginaries of mountains, and increasingly mountains then become something to be consumed rather than to be experienced.
Keeping in mind that most forms of conventional tourism respect the dogma of standardization and consumption, it might be argued that tourism marketing has become more sophisticated, shifting from merely promoting a destination's image to selling an immersive experience, one that aligns with and appeals to the lifestyles and aspirations of consumers. Here we may borrow Walter Benjamin's distinction between two types of experience. On one hand, we have Erfahrungen, a deep, transformative experience that leaves a sign, affects, and shapes a person's identity. And on the other, we have Erlebnissen, an accumulation of fragmented, episodic experiences. Indeed, scholars argue that modern tourism practices, mega events included, are mostly characterized by an accumulation of fragmented experiences. In this sense, the modern tourist is not only a consumer of destinations, but also of experiences. In fact, Martin also made the parallel between the types of experience I just mentioned, in the context of mega events, based on Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle.
Guy Debord, a French sociologist, spoke of the Society of the Spectacle, and initially was only referring really to television in particular as a medium that was presenting people with mediated experiences rather than immediate experiences, for example, of nature, but also of other people. And in many ways, the mountains have been a retreat from that mediation, something where you could experience something authentic, original, unmediated, actually. And of course, mega events are changing that, and they are also bringing the mountain into the mediated sphere. And the reason, of course, why they do this is because if something becomes mediated, it can be sold to many more people at the same time. So an unmediated experience requires your personal presence. But if you have a mediated experience, you can relay that experience, transmit that experience, or broadcast that experience, in the case of the Olympic Games, to people around the world without those people ever having to go to the mountains. So for me, that changes what mountain territories are about. And it also changes the kind of things that people look for in mountains. You know, if nowadays many look for distance or some kind of some kind of even inspiration. I think much more often through mega events we find the very opposites, or a strong sort of consumerism that's linked to mountain territories.
As we slowly reach the end of this episode, we think it's useful to dedicate some minutes to reflect about the Italian context in the Milano-Cortina 2026 Winter Olympics. Cortina is an international touristic attraction mainly during winter season and for winter activities. In the context of Winter Olympics, controversies have risen concerning investments on infrastructure, in particular the bobsleigh project in Cortina. Despite challenges regarding the climate crisis, economic costs, the local demographic decline, and the risk of producing white elephants. In Sarah's opinion, the city continues to treat the non-city, that is the mountains, as a kind of amusement park. According to the Unsustainable Olympic Committee, a group of citizens and organizations opposing the Winter Games, the Milano-Cortina 2026 project has been largely driven by powerful economic and financial interests that have long benefited from Milan's rapid transformation and real estate boom, rather than the mountain territories. We asked Martin to compare the Winter Olympics in Cortina in 1956 with the ones that will take place next year, also considering the experience from Turin 2006 Olympic Games. 70 years later, are we repeating the same patterns, the ones that we described as environmentally, economically, and socially unsustainable, or there is a more sustainable approach this time?
Yes, your question kind of needs to be answered perhaps first by saying what sustainability is, because there are many competing definitions. And sustainability can be defined as a good life for all within planetary boundaries. That's essentially what sustainability is nowadays. So the need to have minimum social indicators assured for all people without over-consuming the resources that our planet provides us with. And this discourse of sustainability has been extremely present and important also for the Olympic Games. So,
in fact, Martin and his research team have developed a model that measures the sustainability of Olympic Games. For our listeners, you will find the link to their publication through the page dedicated on this episode on the Urbanisation website.
It's a model with 9 indicators, and we collected data to apply those 9 indicators to the Olympic Games going back until 1992. And so one thing we found was that the sustainability had not improved since then, but it had actually decreased over time. So despite more and more people talking about how sustainable Olympic Games are, they were actually getting less and less sustainable. So how can one explain that? There are a number of things they're playing into this. One is that the Olympic Games have just, on average, been getting bigger and bigger. So just give you a sense of comparison, if you take the Barcelona Games 1992 and the most recent games in Paris 2024, then you're talking an order of magnitude of times 2, times 3 larger than the Barcelona Games. And so this order, the size means also more infrastructure is needed. It means more people need to come, need to be fed, need to be accommodated, need to be transported. And much of that also, of course, has immediate impact, for example, on carbon dioxide emissions and global warming. So this is one reason. The other reason why they're becoming less sustainable is that increasingly we see that, for example, the Olympic Games tamper with the rule of law. The rule of law is the laws that are in force in a given society or in a given city. And increasingly, part of the standard procedure of hosting Olympic Games is actually to pass a special law that introduces exceptions to many of the existing laws. So for us, that was one way in which the social sustainability of Olympic Games actually declined over those 30 years that we looked at in our study. And then, I mean, one other thing that you see, and I mean, that's also something you see, for example, in Milano Cortina and preparations for the 26 Games, is that Olympic Games consistently go over budget.
In Martin's view, mega events have become an industry that is as much about making money as it is about the sports. In fact, the bobsleigh project in Cortina comes with a hefty price tag of 122 million euros and will result in the loss of hundreds of ancient large trees.
So if you ask me, the Olympic Games in the 1950s were much more sustainable than the ones we have now. So we've not become more sustainable, we've become less sustainable over time. I don't know much about the Cortina Games, but I know quite a bit about the games that happened 8 years before. That was in 1948, because they were the last Olympic Games hosted in Switzerland, in St. Moritz, just across the border. Why would I qualify those as sustainable? Well, because they essentially were relatively small. They had completely untechnologized venues. They actually took place with lots of snow and lots of ice. If you see the pictures from that period, those were really games where you didn't have to worry about having enough snow. And the way that the Olympic Games have been going, and our society in general has been going, has obviously been towards a strong growth, both in economic terms, but also in the consumption of resources, whether this resource is clean air, whether this is any mineral resources we have, or whether it's clean water, etc., etc.
From Sarah's standpoint, mega events such as Milano Cortina come at the expense of local life and viability.
And of course, then we are still promoting these great mega events because of ideas of visibility, of gaining global visibility, which again, I mean, yes, but what for? I mean, and so it's kind of just given for granted that that's good. But the long-term effects are, often include, and this has even been demonstrated by, studies by for example, the Bank of Italy on the impact of the Jubilee. For example, in Rome, they have proven, long-term effects in terms of social inequality, environmental degradation, economic dependence on tourism because of the economic shift, which often involves the creation, yes, of more jobs, but of low-paying jobs, and so that's basically, like poor workers in these poorer sectors, such as restaurant work and hotels, and the loss of better-paying jobs in better in higher sectors, and so. In general, I mean, even in rural areas and mountain areas, the funding of mega events and so the attraction of tourism and mass tourism does produce the same effects as it does in cities. So I would say gentrification, displacement, and in fact in my article I quote a group of a collective of people, of young people living in Cortina, who complain about these negative effects of tourism, saying that this is not bringing new opportunities for the people living in Cortina. But on the contrary, it's kind of impoverishing the city because they're losing public services with this change of function of the city, which is just becoming like a tourist city. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult to live there because of the, increased cost of living, rising property values that are pushing the locals out of their homes.
Seeking the brighter side to close this episode, we asked our guests to reflect on the possibilities of mitigating the tangible and intangible effects of tourism and mega events on mountain territories through alternative, sustainable approaches to tourism. Firstly, we asked Sarah to give her own take on sustainable tourism and on its characteristics, particularly with regard to the mountain landscapes.
I don't know if it's possible to talk about sustainable tourism. I think tourism is totally unsustainable, but it's not because tourism is, our lifestyles are unsustainable. This is, the entire economic system our lives and tourism take place within is unsustainable. So, it's the bigger picture that we have to look at. It's not just, tourism is kind of more an expression of this, where the whole issue, for example, when we take the low-cost revolution, that is exactly the whole problem. It's ordering things on Amazon, which we perceive we're paying very little, but actually the costs of doing that are huge because it's the costs we don't see that are totally unsustainable and which are causing the climate change. And so I think it's the whole economic system within which tourism takes place, which needs to be addressed, in order to be able to talk about something sustainable. Of course, there are kinds of tourism which are much more, which have, a lower environmental impacts concerning, resource consumption, mobility, leisure, which don't alterate, land and preserve natural features. Of course, there are that kind of, I would say, on the supply side, the creation of these experiences is a very positive thing. But I think on the whole, I tend to think more and more that what people are looking for when they want to, escape the city and go into rural mountain areas is actually escaping capitalism itself. And so maybe we should work on that instead of just, providing yet another capitalist answer to the desire to escape this unsustainable system.
If, according to Sarah, tourism is inherently unsustainable, then Martin seems to agree with her in implying that mega events can hardly be sustainable.
At the very end, I think you need to ask a much more fundamental question. And the fundamental question is, if those events are making us build stuff that we don't need later on, why should we host those events in the first place? And I think many cities have asked that question of themselves and they said, no, well, in that case, actually, our answer is we shouldn't host those events. And they're not helping us in any way towards an efficient use of our resources or an efficient development of our infrastructure. They are actually squandering money on very specialized infrastructure that has very limited public benefit afterwards. So sometimes I think this is, for many cities, this is actually the most important question to ask.
Returning to our focus on mountain territories, we wonder whether rethinking time and speed can help reshape tourism. If fast-paced, infrastructure-heavy models are unsustainable, might slower and more sustainable forms of tourism, like slow tourism, offer a better path? For instance, research has proven that infrastructures and policies for slow tourism require minimum investments in comparison to mass tourism and mega events. To close, we asked Sarah whether she thinks that slow tourism can represent an opportunity for restoring mountain territories on a local socio-economic scale, but also in terms of the tourist experience itself.
Oh, yes. I do think it's these are interesting, positive opportunities for restoring mountain territories, for changing, the kind of experience and impact we have there. We can imagine different activities that can foster local, economic development and not only have this like predatory, nature attitude. We can promote, of course, more sustainable tourism practices, and encourage, by doing so, we can encourage deeper interaction with this environment. And I think maybe, it's just time to kind of to listen more than kind of fill in the silence and these like what are perceived as empty spaces. And I think, people have there is a shift in attitude, and people are ready to have a more what we call slow tourism, kind of a shift towards more responsible and conscious travel.
In this episode, we examined mountain territories as non-cities in which the production of space is shaped by practice of leisure. We reflected on the tangible and intangible effects of mountain tourism and mega events and questioned their degree of sustainability. As we have seen, mountains are increasingly undergoing processes of urbanization. For this reason, we take a stance and advocate for defending, protecting, and preserving our mountain landscapes. But while our investigation on the mountains pauses here, a new one begins for Stella and Isabella. So stay tuned for the next episode titled Chipping Away at the Monolith, Reframing the Valle di Le Cross-Border Dam.
Urbinary is produced in collaboration with Polyradio and the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies at Politecnico di Milano.